The stage lights were bright enough to make the polished floor shimmer like water, yet the small figure standing at the center did not flinch. She was only 10 years old, her feet barely reaching the marks taped to the floor, her hands resting calmly at her sides. The audience did not yet know her name, but there was a quiet curiosity in the room, the kind that arrives before something unexpected. When the host finished speaking and stepped away, the silence felt heavier than applause. In that moment, Roni Marley lifted her chin, looked toward the judges, and smiled with a confidence that seemed far older than her years. Her voice had not yet filled the room, but her presence already had. Some whispered to each other, others leaned forward in their seats. A child walking onto a stage is usually met with gentle smiles, encouragement, maybe a touch of skepticism. But there was something different about Roni. Perhaps it was the calm in her eyes, or the way she breathed as if she had done this 1,000 times before. Perhaps it was the weight of a name that carried music through generations, though she herself did not seem burdened by it. She was simply there, ready to sing. Roni Marley was born into a world where music was more than entertainment. It was language, history, resistance, and love. From the moment she could walk, sound followed her like a shadow. Guitars leaned against walls, records spun late into the night, and voices rose in harmonies that felt like home. Yet despite all that surrounded her, her childhood was not about pressure or expectations. It was about play, curiosity, and joy. Music was something she reached for naturally, the way some children reach for crayons or footballs. Her mother often told stories of Roni as a toddler, standing on a chair in the living room, holding a wooden spoon like a microphone, singing along to songs she barely understood. There was no coaching then, no plan, only laughter and clapping from family members who saw something spark within her. They never told her she had to be great. They simply let her be herself. As she grew older, that spark became clearer. At school, teachers noticed how she hummed while working, how her voice carried across playgrounds when she sang for friends. At home, she would sit quietly with headphones on, listening not only to reggae but to soul, jazz, gospel, and blues. She asked questions about rhythm and lyrics, about why some songs made people cry and others made them dance. Her curiosity was endless, and her ears were always open. Despite her famous lineage, her family made a conscious effort to keep her grounded. They wanted her to understand that music was not about fame, but about truth. When she sang, they encouraged her to feel the words, not just perform them. They told her stories about her grandfather, not as a legend, but as a man who believed deeply in the power of voice. They shared how he used music to speak for people who felt unheard, how every note carried meaning. Roni listened closely, absorbing these lessons without even realizing it. When she practiced, she did not mimic or imitate. She explored. Sometimes her voice was soft like a whisper, other times it rose strong and clear. She experimented with melodies, stretching notes, bending them until they felt right. Music was not something she was given. It was something she discovered. The idea of performing on a major stage came unexpectedly. It was not part of a grand plan or a push from adults. Someone heard her sing at a small community event and suggested she audition for a televised talent show in Britain. At first, it sounded like an adventure, nothing more. Roni was excited, curious to see what it would be like. Her family discussed it carefully, making sure she understood that this was not about winning or proving anything. It was about sharing her voice. When they arrived for auditions, the scale of everything was overwhelming. Cameras, bright lights, long corridors filled with hopeful performers of all ages. Some practiced nervously, others laughed loudly to hide their fear. Roni held her mother's hand, looking around with wide eyes, taking it all in. She did not seem scared, but there was a seriousness in her expression, a focus that surprised even those who knew her well. Backstage, as her turn approached, she sat quietly, swinging her feet. A producer asked her how she felt. She smiled and said she was happy. That was all. No nerves, no grand statements. Just happiness. When they called her name, she stood up smoothly, adjusted her outfit, and walked toward the stage as if she belonged there. Now, standing under the lights, she introduced herself with a clear, polite voice. The judges listened attentively, already intrigued. One of them asked her about her family, about her connection to music. Roni answered honestly, without drama. She did not boast or hide. She simply said that music was part of who she was, and that she loved to sing. Then came the moment. The cue was given, the music started softly, and Roni closed her eyes. When she opened her mouth, the first note floated out gently, almost fragile. It was not loud or showy, but it was pure. The room seemed to lean into that sound, drawn by its sincerity. As she continued, her voice grew stronger, richer, filled with emotion that felt far beyond her age. The song she chose was deeply connected to her roots, yet she sang it as if it were her own story. Every word carried feeling. She did not rush. She let the melody breathe, letting pauses speak as loudly as the notes themselves. The audience was silent, many holding their breath without realizing it. As the song built, Roni's confidence became undeniable. She moved slightly with the rhythm, her face reflecting every emotion in the lyrics. There was pain, hope, longing, and joy all woven together. It was not a child imitating a classic. It was a young artist expressing something real. The judges exchanged glances. One leaned forward, eyes wide. Another nodded slowly, a smile spreading across their face. They were not just impressed. They were moved. By the time Roni reached the final lines, some in the audience had tears in their eyes. When she sang the last note and let it fade, there was a split second of stunned silence. Then the room erupted. Applause thundered from every direction, people standing to their feet, clapping and cheering with genuine excitement. Roni opened her eyes fully, surprised by the reaction, her smile widening in disbelief. She had sung from the heart, and the heart of the room had answered back. The judges rose as well, applauding enthusiastically. One of them spoke first, struggling to find words. They said they had seen many talented children, but rarely one who sang with such authenticity. Another judge commented on how she did not rely on tricks or volume, but on emotion and control. They spoke about how her voice carried history, yet sounded completely fresh. When asked how she felt, Roni simply said she was grateful. She thanked the judges, the audience, and her family watching from backstage. Her humility was as striking as her talent. There was no sense of entitlement, no sense of expectation. Only joy. Backstage, her family embraced her tightly, tears of pride streaming down their faces. They knew what she had done was special, but more importantly, they knew she had stayed true to herself. She had not tried to be anyone else. She had just been Roni. The performance spread quickly online. Clips were shared across social media, comments pouring in from around the world. People spoke about how her voice gave them chills, how they could feel the legacy without it feeling forced. Some mentioned her grandfather, but many focused on her alone, recognizing that she was carving her own path. Viewers from different countries wrote about how the performance reminded them why music matters. Teachers showed the clip to students. Parents shared it with their children. Musicians commented on her phrasing and tone, amazed by her instinctive understanding of music at such a young age. Roni herself remained largely unchanged by the sudden attention. She returned to school, played with friends, practiced her singing in her room. Fame did not consume her because it was never the goal. Music was still play, still expression, still joy. Her family continued to guide her gently, protecting her childhood while supporting her growth. They encouraged her to learn, to explore different styles, to write her own songs when she felt ready. They reminded her that the most important thing was to stay honest in her art. As weeks passed, invitations began to arrive. Interviews, performances, collaborations were offered. Each opportunity was considered carefully. Some were accepted, others declined. There was no rush. Roni had time, and everyone around her knew it. When she did speak publicly, she spoke with clarity beyond her years. She talked about how music made her feel, how she hoped her songs could make others feel less alone. She spoke about kindness, about listening, about using voice responsibly. People listened, not because she was young or famous, but because she was sincere. Her story became one of inspiration, not just because of talent, but because of balance. In a world that often pushes young performers too hard, Roni's journey felt different. It felt careful, loving, and true. As she continued on the show, each performance revealed another layer of her artistry. She experimented with different songs, different moods. Sometimes she was playful, other times deeply reflective. Each time, the audience responded with enthusiasm, eager to see where she would go next. The judges watched her grow, offering guidance without pressure. They spoke about how rare it was to see someone so young yet so connected to the meaning of music. They emphasized that her greatest strength was not her voice alone, but her understanding of why she sang. For Roni, the stage became a place of sharing rather than proving. She sang not to impress, but to communicate. That intention reached people in ways that technical perfection alone never could. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, she stood backstage listening to the applause echo through the hall. She held her mother's hand and whispered that she felt happy. That simple word carried everything. Happiness was her compass, guiding each step. As the season moved forward, speculation grew about how far she would go. Fans debated outcomes, critics analyzed performances, media outlets wrote headlines. Roni remained focused on the present moment, on the next song, the next feeling. Her journey reminded many of the power of beginnings, of how talent, when nurtured with care and honesty, can shine without burning out. Of how a child, given space to grow, can teach the world something important. When people spoke about her legacy, those closest to her gently redirected the conversation. They spoke about her future instead, about the stories she had yet to tell, the songs she had yet to write. They understood that legacy is not something to inherit, but something to build, slowly and thoughtfully. Roni Marley's voice continued to travel far beyond that stage in Britain. It traveled into homes, hearts, and memories. It reminded listeners of warmth, resilience, and hope. It reminded them that music, at its best, is a bridge between generations, cultures, and souls. For Roni, the journey was just beginning. She still had much to learn, much to experience. But one thing was already clear to everyone who heard her sing. Her talent was not unbelievable because of her age or her name. It was unbelievable because of its truth. And as she stepped off the stage that night, the lights dimming behind her, she carried with her not the weight of expectation, but the lightness of purpose. She was a young girl with a powerful voice, ready to grow, ready to listen, ready to sing her own song into the world.